Welcome to The Pivot, where we explore the shifts that open new possibilities for how we see, act, and navigate the world. Right now, so much is changing, faster than we can make sense of. It's easy to feel unmoored, caught between an unraveling past and a future that's still, taking shape. But there are those who can already see what's emerging, beyond the noise, beyond the confusion. In each episode, I sit down with visionaries, thinkers, practitioners, and pioneers who are not just imagining the future, but actually living it. They're sensing what's next and mapping the way forward. So if you're wondering how to navigate this shifting landscape, how to stay grounded, adapt, and even thrive, you're in the right place. This is not about quick fixes or the 7 steps to be more effective. This is about asking the right questions of yourself, of each other, of life, learning how to make sense of this changing terrain and how to move in it. You don't have to figure it out alone. I've got you covered. This is The Pivot. Welcome. Today, I'm in conversation with Sonja Blignaut, a longtime collaborator and fellow edgewalker whose work lives at the intersection of complexity science, human transformation, and embodied leadership. Sonja is based in South Africa and brings a rare and powerful blend of systems thinking, deep embodiment, and poetic wisdom. She draws from natural sciences, myth, and indigenous wayfinding traditions to help individuals, leaders, and teams navigate deep uncertainty and continuous transition. In this episode, we explore the art of wayfinding as a practice for navigating the unknown. We go into why complexity isn't just ambiguity, but a braiding together of what we have kept apart. And the difference between rewilding and untaming, and how both are vital now. What it means to be a tuning fork for emergence, and how we're all a part of a collective rite of passage. This is a rich, honest, and deeply human conversation, not about solving uncertainty, but about how to stay in it, attuned, and awake. Let's drop in. Well, welcome, Sonja.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here.
Oh, I'm thrilled. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time. We go back a little ways. We've been exploring together, and our work is very much mirroring each other, paralleling each other, and complementing. So maybe that's a good way to start is, what would you like to say about yourself and the work you're doing?
That's always an interesting place to start, Dave. I never know where to start exactly.
I know.
But I'll just go with what comes up. So if my accent hasn't given me away already, I'm based in South Africa. And my work up to now has been predominantly in the field of applied complexity. And sometimes I feel the only thing that people need to know about me is that I'm from South Africa, because it feels like that alone gives me some credentials for navigating uncertainty and complexity.
Indeed.
And I come from the natural sciences. I studied meteorology. And it's a very long story how I ended up where I am. But, nowadays I mostly work with people. And I find them endlessly fascinating. There's many weather metaphors that you could probably apply. But I've realized recently my career has not unfolded in linear ways, so looking back, I realized I could not have planned this at all. But that's what I do. I help people find their way through uncertainty.
Yeah, well said. That's really key. And you've got some very interesting, since I've known you, a very new way of approaching this and unfolding that I don't see anywhere else. That was the initial attractor. You're talking about this in a different way. And there's so much out there on complexity. There's so much out there on the meta crises. but you bring something very, very different to it. So where would you like to start?
Sure. I think, well, maybe something that has been very salient to me, Dave, and I think that's maybe also where the slightly different perspective comes from, is what I've realized probably in the last 3 years or so, although I'm sure it goes back a bit further if I really go and scratch. It feels like in the past, those of us who consult or who coach or, work as mentors, even if it's unconsciously, I think we were engaging from a place of feeling like maybe we are a little bit more on solid ground or a little bit ahead of the people that we were working with. Personally, I got that sense of stability, I suppose, from my knowledge, my experience, my expertise, a very heady place of understanding complexity. And something that I've noticed that I believe is a bit of a shift is we are all in the flux. Michael Meade, he's a mythologist. He says to be alive in this time is to be in the liminal phase of a collective rite of passage. I really love that because it's for me, it's a reframe of this idea of meta-crisis, polycrisis. If I put the rite of passage lens on it, it feels a little bit more hopeful. It feels like maybe there's a maturing, a collective maturing. But my experience of this has been continuous transition. Things that used to work no longer working, old identities no longer fitting. And in that flux, I am still serving clients, and so there's we're all in this together kind of a sense, and I think that's where this idea of wayfinding, for me, it's very embodied. It's part of my own journey.
Beautiful. Yeah. I can really relate. And in my own work, a major shift happened a while ago where, just like you were saying, we would say we're a bit ahead or we're positioned or oriented such that we can help our clients step into their greatest potential. And I noticed that I always had a change agenda underneath, kind of humming in the background. I know what you need to do. I know the gap. I know how to fix / heal / improve. And this shift to where we're all being touched. The word that seems to float around for me a lot is this unfolding. Standing in the mystery, we really don't know totally what's happening, the complexity that you talk about, the many forces at play. And the best we have to navigate that is not looking at old maps, or the way things were done, best practices in the corporate arena. So we're in new territory, and I really like, and I get excited about Michael Meade's quote. This idea of it's a liminal time. So it's not end of times. It's not an ending. It's not a crash. It's an in between. And in between times, things are crazy. Things are breaking. Things are bubbling. I think of the time I was in Iceland, and you're literally seeing new islands shaping, right, and taking form, and this ancient land. So the blend of both. So how are we maturing into it? And rite of passage, I like that you brought the word collective into that, because I think so much around transformation has that hero's journey kind of metaphor into it, that it's very solo, very alone. And I think what we're facing these days, the new capacity that's evolving in us is the collective. So the fact that you are in transition, undergoing change yourself, in the midst of guiding others and helping others, it actually lends credibility and trust, I find.
It does, and it's one of the reasons why I love complexity so much, and it's also a different way that I've started looking at it. It's so the theory would say, complexity it's ambiguous, and there's uncertainty is baked in. But if you just look at the etymology of the word, it means braided together. It's entwined. And it doesn't really serve us in complexity, all of these, I suppose, false dichotomies that we've created. It's the individual or it's the collective. It's, the split between masculine and feminine, for example. All of these things, the secular and the sacred. We've kept these things apart. And complexity for me is a space, it's an invitation to re-entwine these things. And it's really interesting. The other day I was speaking to a group of coaches, and just for interest's sake, I Googled the etymology of the word coach. And I don't know if you know this, but it actually comes from a literal coach, like a vehicle that takes people.
No kidding.
No, I think it's Hungarian initially. Go and Google it. It's super interesting.
That's great.
And I was thinking, that is actually such a perfect analogy, because we tend to think of ourselves as taking people from one place to another, from, like helping them reach their goals. As you say, some of it is very under the surface. We might say that we just accompany them, but we want to see results. We want to see them develop. We want some kind of an outcome. And to let go of that. And, I love what you say on your website when you call yourself an inner wilderness guide. I think that's very much, I resonate with that, also in terms of the work I do. And a lot of this unfolding is also, I think, an excavating. It's rewilding and untaming and letting go of the aspects that no longer serves. And also to let go of needing outcomes, setting goals. Just kind of being in the present and allowing that unfolding. And I'm under no illusion that it's easy, Dave. But it does feel like that is the invitation.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. It is. You've said some things in there that really have me leaning forward. The braid, I think that's such a powerful image. It's very different than, how we traditionally think about these polarities, these tensions where we're somehow trying to cut through the middle, like somehow the middle is the sweet spot. But the braiding, the intertwining of elements of both, that's something completely different and much more nuanced. I think it handles this uncertainty and what can emerge, what can come through that's new, much easier, The other things that you touched on that got me was rewilding and then letting go.
I've noticed, the word rewilding has been in the space, in the field for a while. But what I've mostly in the context of, I suppose, the external, rewilding ecologies or, and then it started coming into, rewilding leadership and rewilding. It became a bit of a buzzword. But if you really sit with it, and there's an interesting relationship for me, or an interplay between rewilding and untaming, and they've got slightly different qualities. I'm not entirely sure, So when I speak, the imagery I use, for rewilding, very often I would use imagery, contrasting a very manicured green lawn with a wildflower meadow. It's almost, how can we bring in more diversity? And inner rewilding for me, it's how do we welcome those parts we've exiled? There's like how do we also let go of this notion that we only have a single identity? So there's that aspect. And then the untaming, it's like it sometimes it feels like we've become so domesticated. And and it requires courage. I'll speak for myself. It's even just in how we show up, and I think there's a slightly different quality to it, even for women. Like what is allowed? How are you allowed to show up? What are you allowed to say? And so there's a really interesting interplay here. Like, how do we untame ourselves and have a completely different relationship with uncertainty and the unknown, and how we show up in that? And then at the same time, how do we rewild? And that rewilding, I think, is also, it goes into, again, the collective. How do we rewild our relationships? How do we rewild the organizations we're part of to make them more resilient, but also just more human and planet friendly?
These are important distinctions. I really like them. I think the rewilding, there's kind of a return. It sounds like that's the theme I was hearing. I think about our own yard. We don't cut much of it anymore. We're letting it go back to nature, the bio aspects of it. Then the untaming, as I listened to you, the image was almost taking the lid off. Like, what are the cultural agreements, the constraints that are invisible to us that we're operating from? And how do we remove them? And how do you do that when you don't see them? They're felt. Either, I don't know. What do you think? Like as a woman, what are the invisible constraints that you may not see, but you certainly feel? What are the constraints I have even talking about the work that we do? What's the filtering that goes on? When we were kind of connecting before we started the recording, it's like our own ability to stay in the unfolding, in the mystery, and provide service, provide value. Like these tensions. Yeah, I'm curious about that.
And the image that comes to my mind with untaming, it very much is, it's like a tiger or a lion sitting, like in a circus or in a cage. And I don't know if you've read Glennon Doyle's book about, I think it's called Untamed. But it starts with this wonderful story about a cheetah whose best friend is a dog, and who performs basically for people to see how fast she can run by chasing a bunny that she never catches. And how Glennon, in that moment, it's like she wants to just say to this cheetah, you're a cheetah. This is not what you were born to do. And I think there definitely is, the question that's related for me to this is, what have we normalized? And some of the things that we've normalized just makes absolutely no sense. But, I find myself continuously not necessarily saying exactly what I want to say, but editing it slightly so that it's a bit more palatable.
Yes.
And I think for women, there is also, and I don't want to generalize, I'm sure, just this morning what came up was, I think it's Thoreau who said, we live lives of quiet desperation.
Yes.
And so there's, I think that also comes from this taming, this, like, what is it that the wild self wants to express? The parts of us that still remember when we were closer to the earth, when we were not so forced to conform, I suppose, to societal norms.
Yes, I can see that. I love that you brought in the Thoreau quote. The word disquiet has come up in my work, and often it's the, that 3 a.m. wide awake feeling, that third rail hum, of unease. And, before COVID, maybe 15 years ago even, I was starting to see it in clients that, a theme was they were successful by all the cultural standards of success, but there was this stirring, this kind of what's going on? What else? They've climbed all the mountains. And, if we dig down deep enough, it's a hunger for meaning, a longing for meaning. But what I've noticed certainly since COVID, and absolutely now, this disquiet is like an existential angst, a constant hum that's in the background of everyone. And I'm watching friends, I'm watching clients, colleagues get caught up, and it's very easy to start kind of going down the rabbit holes of doomed scrolling and end of times, and really getting almost like a malaise or a depression or an anxiety that's constant. So I think you're touching something really important. And this untaming, how do we recognize the constraints and then release them and move towards greater authenticity, expression, getting in touch with what's important to us?
I don't really have definitive answers for you, Dave, but something that worked for me. One of the things that I realized was I was completely cut off from my body. I grew up in a context where what was affirmed and what was rewarded was the intellect. It was academic performance. It was, and to add to that, my father was my teacher when I was, when I was younger. So he taught mathematics and Afrikaans. And so I still have him on my shoulder every now and again when I have to talk. Like yesterday, I was interviewed for a podcast in Afrikaans, and I cannot speak about complexity in Afrikaans. But now I had all of this anxiety, like, how am I going to show up and not, mix languages all the time? And I had the Afrikaans teacher on the shoulder. That entanglement is still there.
Yeah.
But what really helps me when it comes to this idea of getting in touch with, I don't know what you want to call it, the inner child, the wild self, the soul self, is to drop into the body.
Yes.
And I only really discovered that my body does not exist just to carry a big head around, when I was when I was 50 years old, So more and more I'm like, we need to get into nature. That's the one. And we need to get back in the body. The body remembers.
That's right.
And it's something that makes it harder is, and maybe this is also just still a remnant of the taming, but in many circles, things like embodiment practices, even just a conversation like this would immediately be slapped with the label of woo-woo. And so to work, for example, with an executive team, recently I put in a proposal for an executive team that starts with a 90-minute sound journey. Because there was this whole, we are, the way that they would phrase it is, we're not on the same page. It feels like we're not completely connected. And I'm like, well, maybe you need to become attuned to the same frequency, not necessarily get on the same page. And it took a lot of courage to submit that proposal because, I still have this is going to be seen as woo-woo. And so I think that's also part of the untaming, is to get to a point where you don't care, where these labels get slapped on you.
You're so right. I'm really enjoying this because the woo-woo alert is always sitting on my shoulder. But you know what it's done is it's how it's served is I've gotten creative. So, so the esoteric, or what's coming from the wisdom traditions, or, what I'm seeing out there is we don't need more rationality to navigate. We need the imaginal. We need creativity and imagination. So how do we tap it? And have to say I kind of enjoy the decoding or the unlock. You know, I can't remember if I told you, but I had a room full of FBI agents, and I really felt they would benefit from becoming more grounded, right? And I wanted to teach them meditation, but I remember feeling terrified. If I used the M word, I would have been burned at a stake back then. So, you know, when I relaxed and dropped in, the idea came, well, what is the essence of this? And I said, you know, would it be good to take a tactical pause every once in a while? Because I was honoring their structure of interpretation. And I still remember like, yeah, they were going like, tactical pause. Hey, you know, that would be really good. So we did meditation, and I wanted to have them track their progress and what was coming through, even through their dreams, you know, and really capture that. But I knew if I used journaling as a word, I would have been kicked out. So I talked about a data acquisition log, and they loved it. You know, it's like, yeah, well, that makes sense, right? And this wasn't a manipulation. It really was sensing into what are the structures, you know, what are those invisible, you know, as we're talking about the taming structures that keep them in place, and how can we come in and unlock that? Once they were in it, then I started using the M word and the J word, and they were totally cool with it by then. So like you with the vibrations, like once they can see the application, something does get unleashed, doesn't it?
And I think I think Trish Blaine, that we both know, you know, she talks about creating these airlock experiences.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor, isn't it?
Yeah,
go ahead.
And something that I've realized about myself, you know, I've always felt a little bit like I don't really fit. Like I'm a little bit of an outsider in all of the...
Yes.
But what I've realized looking back is, you know, I've kind of always been, I suppose, a liminal creature. I was born, my star sign is on the cusp between Pisces and Aries.
Oh, no kidding.
I was born to, you know, all of my friends had parents who I suppose in the categorization would be boomers. I was born very late in my parents' lives, so they were silent generation. So I never really fit into the... I was sent to school a year earlier than my peers, so I was always a bit younger. I've got so many of these examples, you know, and what I've come to realize is it allows me to be a bridge. Mm-hmm. So even you know, even before, you know, this shift happened to me, you know, I think Brene Brown calls it the midlife unraveling. I can so relate to that. But even before then, you know, I always kind of spanned these boundaries between the deep academic theorists, natural scientists, you know, people who work with nature, business, artists, you know, I find I can bridge all of, you know, these spaces.
Yes. Yes.
And I feel this is another bridge, you know, it's almost, how do you bridge the rational with the embodied and the sacred?
Yes.
And
that's right.
That feels like it's where we are at the moment, because that search for meaning that you spoke about.
Yes.
I think people are, some of the desperation comes from, I guess, almost the sterility of the lives that we've created. You know, I don't know, well, I suppose regardless of what your religious or spiritual beliefs are, it's very hard to imagine that our souls came here to climb ladders, sit in 9-to-5 jobs, be in back-to-back meetings.
Yes.
I just don't see it, you know, and
yeah, I agree.
And so I do sense that there is more of a readiness. I think people, especially post-COVID, I think people, there has to be more than this to life.
Yeah. That's the marker for our current time, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, and we share something with the bridging for sure. And I'm glad you brought in Trish's airlock, How do you transition from the spaceship into space? Without that airlock, it's too much of a jolt, isn't it? Yeah, as you were speaking about your own bridging, I was appreciating it. My bridge, I see now. I too felt like an outsider. I also had a career in intelligence, so it was important to be invisible and blend in and understand systems and complexity in a very tactical way and in a very fast way. And I can feel the strength of those muscles. But for a long time, I felt like an outsider that didn't fit. Now I can see the gold in that bridging and that airlock, and helping leaders or helping people that are up to something navigate. And also, I'd love to hear your feel on this. As bad as some things really seem to be these days, and every day there's a new level of crumbling or disintegration, I'm actually excited. And this is where I do feel a little bit on the outside from mainstream. I'm optimistic. It's true that these transitions are not going to be easy. They're going to be quite significant, quite dramatic, and quite painful. But what's already emerging is getting me really excited. And I can share what I'm seeing, but I'd love to see, where are you on that? What on that spectrum? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I'd love to know what you're seeing, Dave.
Yeah,
I
sure.
think I vacillate a little bit. Every now and again, I look, for example, at what's happening in Gaza, for example, and some of the humanitarian crises, what's happening to the planet, and I feel it quite viscerally.
Yes.
The species that's disappearing, the fires, so I feel it, and then in that moment, I can feel the pull of the hopelessness, what are we doing? How can humanity stoop so low? All of this. And then at the same time, I also understand that sometimes things need to crumble and collapse for something new to emerge, and even just the way that we framed darkness. We've framed it as something negative, but it's in the darkness where seeds germinate. It's in the darkness where a baby is formed in the womb, so and this idea of the collective rite of passage, if you look at a rite of passage, it's, here in South Africa, what what those young boys go through, it's not a pleasant process.
Yes,
to
indeed.
mature. It's like a butterfly and the caterpillar. It's not a pleasant process going through that transformation. So I think I'm more towards the hopeful side, but I have my hopeless.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. Me too. In fact, I've had almost equal swings. Sometimes I feel like I'm oscillating really fast. This week, this week we lost a village here in Switzerland to, the retreat of the permafrost, the release of a melting glacier, and the mountain came down on a village. And thankfully, almost everyone was gone by then. So, very, very visceral, very close up, almost on a not quite daily, but certainly monthly basis, seeing visible changes in the climate. I've lost some people in both Ukraine and in Russia. So these things aren't theoretical or so far out there that I can't connect to them. They're very close in. And at the same time, I was in a retreat in the Black Forest, and the majority of the people there were under 30. And the level of consciousness, their capacity to hold so much, their curiosity, I was in awe. I was just stunned, at what their capacity is at their age, and seeing what I'm still struggling to work with is amazing. If I had that in the 20s, amazing. And to really tune into what life is like for them, navigating, when they were born, what their adolescent period is like. It's so different than my world. And yet there's this bright light. There's a real air of possibility and creativity. So I was very surprised and inspired. So it's these little things, or, there's been a lot of new publications and conversations around what do we do in the midst of all this. And the theme seems to be, first of all, be connected and be local. So, kind of the community building. And it makes me think of the rewilding. It's going back to something very fundamental and very old, of building community, of kind of in your sphere of control. How do you control your mini culture? And even as a personal compass, to be kind, to show kindness to others, to connect to the fact that we're in this together. I keep seeing parallels to what I would call very sophisticated or esoteric or even woo-woo lines of thinking, but in very, very practical ways. So it is this mix, right? And I go back to what you said earlier about the braid, and what you just said about darkness. There's a braiding in of, the horrors of Gaza, the horrors of what's going on, and this new emergence, and this incredible new level of connection that's being invited. So, yeah.
And I think there's, just to link to what you said, what I'm also seeing more and more of that I find really encouraging, and I'm always careful because I'm also aware of, this confirmation bias, that you tend to see what you look for. But
that's right.
I don't know if you've noticed, Dave, but the word love has started coming up in business contexts more and more. I don't know if you've seen that.
It's true.
It's from
You're right.
Marcus Buckingham, who is doing research, I think it's at Harvard, around the role of love in engagement and in the workplace. And then there's in one of the I was interviewed for a Futures podcast a while back, and he was the guest just before me, Marcus Bussey, and he spoke about love as a primary organizing principle for the future, and how we emit future's pheromones. I'm still kind of sitting with that analogy, but
it's pretty cool.
But if you do tap into the frequency of love, I guess the more people that step into that, it feels like we can bring about much more hopeful futures if that is the organizing principle.
Very, very interesting. Yeah.
And then other things that I'm seeing, it's there's some really interesting things happening specifically in the Netherlands. I don't know. Again, I don't know if it's just because but there does seem to be a greater openness there for, I suppose, bringing in or combining, re-entwining the sacred and business. One of the people I follow on LinkedIn, she talks about boardroom witches. It's as if there's a greater openness, and I think maybe what is starting to crumble a little bit is our worship of science, and our tendency to dismiss anything that we can't find a scientific explanation for as nonsense or pseudoscience, or I think there's a greater openness for the spiritual, the things that we don't necessarily understand.
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. In fact, that's why I've brought into my work non-ordinary states, expanded consciousness, whether it's through dream work, psychedelics, whether it's through breath work. There's the expansion, and I kind of hold this as the imaginal world, which is something we couldn't even talk about. Actually, we didn't know how to talk about it. But I think growing more and more, I'm getting the sense that we don't need more rational. We need more imaginal. And that seems critical.
I think the rational is what got us here.
Yeah,
And
right.
there's a the thing is, coming from a science background also, I don't want to throw it, the baby out with the bathwater, but there's an arrogance in the scientism world that we can figure everything out, and if we can't prove anything scientifically, then it must not be real. Or it must not.
That's right.
There's an arrogance in that, and I think it's part of this split also, the human from nature. So we put ourselves in this position where we are the ones that get to figure nature out and apply our will to it, rather than we are in it, we're part of it, we're entwined in it.
Yes. Yeah. So that braid comes back again. So the braiding of science and, the rational and the imaginal, the braiding of what we know and don't know.
And the mysticism, the ancient wisdom traditions, and this is also something. So I'm fascinated, for example, with the Polynesian Wayfinders and the Inuit and those wisdom traditions. But then every now and again, I also realize there's a fine line of how to honor those traditions, how to work with it and not appropriate. So there's also a very fine line there. But it feels like that indigenous knowledge, those ancient wisdom traditions, are a core part of this braid. It's a remembering. I think, and that goes almost back to the untaming and the rewilding. I feel like they have been holding the wisdom and been keeping it kind of, safe until the rest of us were ready to remember.
We had to catch up, didn't we? Would you like, this might be a great place to talk a little bit more about your work with Wayfinding.
So I've been working on this for several years. And initially it emerged from, I suppose, my own attempts to make meaning and understand some of what was coming out of the complexity theorists' work at the time. And I found it a little bit confusing and not easily, made practical. And so then I went kind of looking for metaphors and analogies, I suppose, but also who are the people groups, who are the people who are really good in uncertainty at navigating complexity in a very embodied way. And several things came to mind, even, jazz musicians. I know that you are very familiar with that. But then also some of these ancient wisdom traditions, and in particular the Polynesian Wayfinders. They were known, or they basically, what people say is, they were like the astronauts of their time. That is how good they were and are at navigating uncharted territory. And I think that's the key thing. When we use the word navigate, we tend to think of modern navigation with instruments and compasses and maps. And they had their ability to navigate the natural world, their knowledge of that, and their wisdom traditions, which is very much linked into their spiritual beliefs as well. But that's what they had. They had no compasses, nothing. So basically where the Wayfinder came from is a weaving of many different threads, some of them from complexity theory, specifically around how you work with constraints. It's one of the key things in complexity is because we can't manage outcomes. What we need to do is create the conditions for beneficial emergence, and we do that by managing constraints. Like what shapes the system. So that combined with metaphors and practices from wisdom traditions like the Polynesians. And this is where I said, I'm always on a fine line here, with, and then also just the practices of jazz musicians, and understanding how humans work and what happens when they're in uncertainty. Because one of the things that I see, and you probably see this in your work as well, is when we are in uncharted territory, when we're in the complete unknown, our nervous system tends to either go into, fight, flight, freeze, or we just revert back to our old ways of knowing. And one of the things is when we are in uncharted territory, there are so many possibilities. It's like this field of potential. And that can feel so overwhelming that we don't move. And so one of the things that the Wayfinder does at its core is it allows us to create a contained option field to explore so that it feels safer to take small steps, and also so that it feels safer to go right up to the edges. Because, it's a little bit like children, young children, if they don't know where the boundaries are, they stay close to mom. Yep. And even me, myself, I don't necessarily have a fear of heights, but if I'm somewhere high and there's no guardrail,
yes,
I don't go to the edge, and
it kicks right in, doesn't it?
and I believe what's needed now are some edge explorations, to really push these frontiers out. And so the Wayfinder at its, it's actually quite a simple framework. It's a scaffolding, it's a living framework, but it starts with orienting. So where am I now, or where are we now in context with, or in relationship with this ever-changing context? Because we assume we know. So people often want to skip that step, but that's actually one of the most important. Where are we in relation to what's around us and in relation to what we want to explore? What direction do we want to head into? So not what goal do we want to set or what outcome do we want? What direction do we want to go into? And this is also a constraint, because if I've chosen to go north, I'm no longer going south, so it excludes. What guardrails do I put in place? One guardrail I acknowledge. So where can't I go? This might be, like a friend of mine uses this for coaching, working with people who have chronic illness. And there's just some things that your body no longer allows. Or in a corporate, there might be laws that you have to, conform with.
Sure.
You mentioned psychedelics. For me and my practice, I can't really easily include that because it's illegal. So there's a hard boundary that I need to acknowledge. And then on the other guardrail is, what do we choose to focus on? What do we choose to exclude? What is in, what is out? And what values are so important to us that they shape where we explore? And then that creates, you'll see my hands go like this all the time, but it creates like a wedge. And within that wedge, you can explore safely. You know where you, more or less where you want to go. You know where the guardrails are. You know where you are. So now you can take small steps. And every time you take a step, you reorient because now things have shifted. So it is a way to enable people to keep moving when they're in the unknown. That's essentially what it is, to make the path by walking.
Beautiful. What I love about this, what excites me, is my interpretation as I take it in, is it creates a field for emergence and possibility, as opposed to this linear path, which is what we kind of tend to think of when we're trying to navigate something or move something or get what we want or close a gap. And this is much more fluid, which allows, I suspect, greater agility for the unknown that comes up, the obstacles, the creative challenges that require movement and innovation, and through it all, resilience.
I love that you bring in the word field, because what's starting to emerge for me now, almost I guess as the work evolves, is wayfinding is a process of attunement.
Yes.
And it's harmonizing to some extent, so some people see the guardrails almost as negative. It's like, oh, you can't go here. But it's like, what patterns can I harmonize with? It's even when you start thinking about future. I don't like to put the word "the" in front of future anymore, because it's not a noun and it's not singular. It's but like attuning to a direction that feels alive and harmonizing to the current constraints. That's how I'm starting to think of it. But it is a field.
Yeah, and the harmonics that you're bringing in. So the vibrational quality, resonance. These are things that we all understand at a very basic human level. We know it in our experience. So what I like about this is it's not metaphoric. It's experiential, and we can get into that. I'm curious, what's your take on the role of yourself in this, or the role of a coach or a guide in wayfinding? Because I suspect it's not of the paradigm of, you're there to fix, you're there, something, like we started the conversation, you're ahead and you're holding space for them. This is something very different, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's still emerging also. I think it's somewhere in between your idea of a wilderness guide, although that's still to some extent implies that you know the terrain a little bit better than the person. And this is different because I don't necessarily, if it's completely uncharted, I also don't know the terrain. But I am a half a step ahead when it comes to the practices, the stance, like how to be in right relationship with an unfolding unknown. I think that's the...
Yeah, beautiful.
And I
like this. Yeah,
go ahead. I think it's... So the metaphor that comes to mind, but I'm still figuring out myself how to work with it. It's almost like you show up as a tuning fork. As a frequency to resonate with, as I don't quite know, but it is very different because it's not something, I can teach people, and I do teach people, how to use the framework, what some of the practices are. But you really can only learn how to do ways finding when you do ways finding.
Yes, that's right. I appreciate the slight struggle or the exploration of our role in this. And, the inner wilderness guide, I think the image I have is in unknown territory, we know how to work in unknown territory. Like there's something in our capacity, to continue with the metaphor, in our saddlebags that we can reach into to help. But we don't know where we're going. And that's part of it, right? I love this tuning fork capacity as well, because it's sensing in. But there's a neutrality in the receiving somehow that I get, that I think is really important. So it doesn't fit into an agenda. It really is staying in that emergent quality. And what I'm wondering is maybe our struggle, which I think is a good struggle, by the way, the words don't exist yet because we're at the edges. We are in unknown. And so any word has, any descriptor has the limitation of an old way of thinking, which is inherently problematic. But I think the qualities that you're bringing in, the qualities I'm bringing in, again, this braiding movement feels useful here as well.
And I think the essence of it is that you're, to use, you're in the boat with the people that
Yes.
you're not somewhere ahead. You're not
That's
standing
right.
on the side, like the image that comes to mind is a swimming coach that stands on the side and, kind of,
Yes.
you're not doing
That's right.
that. You're
No.
in it. And maybe you're a tiny bit ahead, but I don't know about you, but every time I work with people in this context, I learn more
Totally.
about what it is that's unfolding. And sometimes I feel what I bring, and it's interesting because people have mentioned this in the past, and I was like, I don't really know where you get that, because I don't see myself like that. But I think it's the ability to manage our nervous systems when we're in the unknown. It's that ability to, people say, oh, you're so calm. You've got this serenity about you. And I'm like, okay, if you say so. I don't necessarily perceive myself like that, but I think it's the ability to hold.
Yes.
To hold the unknown, to hold the unraveling sometimes, to normalize that it's okay to feel the way you're feeling, but we can still keep moving. We don't have to be stuck.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're putting your finger on something very critical as a capacity that it's sometimes hard for us to see. It's almost like, can we dive, deep sea dive to 900 meters to work with people at 300 meters? I remember having to take a defensive driving course as part of my job, and to be able to start knowing how to control a car at high speed, they pushed us, and we were on a racetrack and going around and around and around and just going faster, faster, faster till we lost control of the car and left the track and went into hay so that we were safe. But we needed to know that moment of losing, where the tire could no longer stay with traction on the road, to then learn how to maneuver and take it to the edge. And I suspect there's a capacity building that's happening in our work for us that is a benefit to others.
And I think it has to do with the ability to sit in discomfort and the ability to be in the liminal.
Yep. That's right.
Because what I see a lot and what I've noticed is when I go there, my ability to add value to clients disappears. It's when you go into fear.
Yep.
So when you see the old is unraveling. So for me, it's been very real. Like old ways of generating business, the ways that I used to generate an income, the things that used to be really easy, no longer works. And when I go into fear and I start acting from there, I actually end up making things worse and pushing clients away. It's
so true.
But if I can stay in trust in that moment, like, yes, it's liminal. Yes, I don't know what's coming, but I've been here before. It's actually how my entire career has unfolded. That's how a meteorologist ends up doing what I'm doing. And you can kind of hold that frequency.
Yeah.
It helps others hold more as well.
That's right. Because there's a resonance, right? So your calm of having done that before, this space, you trust this space. I'm picking up on that. So my nervous system is starting to calm down. And I may still not completely trust it yet because I'm new, but my eye is on you. My system is in resonance with you. And then that creates an opening for my own experience. Yeah. I like that.
Yeah, and as you say, I don't think that we have a word yet to describe that kind of relationship. Because it's not a coach, it's not a mentor, it's not a consultant, it's not an advisor. It's something else.
That's right. I think our colleague Trish has said something like edge worker. And that seems to be the closest so far. Yeah. Maybe what's next for you? What's calling you with the Wayfinders program or anything else that's whispering to you from the future?
So I definitely want to lean into the Wayfinding work more, and specifically around, I suppose, embodying it and finding new ways to live in this relationship. Like, like whether it's helping individuals, something that I'm seeing is where people really seem to experience the full messy glory of complexity is in the middle of transitions. And we're all in transition now, so so finding a way to potentially work one-on-one in this kind of tuning fork edge worker way. I run embodied Wayfinding journeys online, but then I think something that really feels like it's calling me at the moment is potentially shifting or looking at in-person retreats, with people who do complementary things, go out in nature, spend the time. I think that's the thing is, like really step out of the rat race and spend time to come into resonance with whatever it is that's calling you, whatever, into the future. Or I feel with the rise of AI, and I'm not anti-AI, I think there are really ways that, well, I'm exploring how can I, use AI to, I suppose, take some of the virtual work off of my plate, if I can call it that, so that I can spend more time in person. But something that I see is there's a longing for real connection. Although many people don't, I think they see it as a luxury. I think they look at the to-do lists and they're like, oh, I can't afford to do this now. And I think that is going to be the primary challenge to overcome, is to say, I think it's Bayo or Kumalafe that says times are urgent, let's slow down.
Yes, it's counterintuitive. Yeah.
And so I do feel, and in these retreats, I suppose I want to push the edges, like work with frequency, work with sound, work with altered states of consciousness, it's and then bring the grounding, I suppose, of complexity, Wayfinding, these scaffolds that's been built.
Beautiful. I would love to explore with you. We're already talking about maybe doing retreats together, which will be a blast. I'd love to explore how to do integration in this work. So I think there's a coming together, a consolidation, and still leveraging or still acknowledging the liminal space and the imaginal, and then how to transfer, how to bring this into our daily lives so that it doesn't stay a peak experience or a very valuable rejuvenation and recharge. But I think there's even more available. So I'm excited to be exploring this with you.
I would love that. And I agree. I think the risk that we have is that it's just one more thing to tick off the list that you've done this retreat.
That's right.
And it never, a word that I've gotten, a little bit fascinated by is enchantment. Like, how do we re-enchant the world? And by that, I mean everything around us, not just a retreat experience.
I love that word. So rewilding, untaming, enchanting, and braiding. I've loved it. I'll put your website and information about Wayfinding in the show notes. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention in this moment to direct listeners who are interested in connecting with you or learning more?
I'm quite active on LinkedIn, so they're welcome to
Okay,
connect with
good.
me there. And as you can hear, I love talking about these things. So I quite often, do speaking engagements and work with
Great.
teams. So anything along those lines. And they must look out for our joint retreat once it finds
Absolutely.
expression.
Absolutely, that's right. Well, I'll put all the links in the show notes.
Thank you.
This has been an absolute pleasure, a real joy, and exciting. Thank you.
That's a wrap for today's conversation with Sonja. I hope you found, as I did, a sense of resonance in the way she speaks about complexity, not as something to solve, but as a space to inhabit. A space where rewilding, untaming, and wayfinding become not just metaphors, but really essential practices for this moment. If Sonja's insights moved something in you, I encourage you to explore more of her work at morebeyond, morebeyond.co.za, or connect with her on LinkedIn. There, she regularly shares reflections, practices, and provocations that meet this edge that we're all living on. And if this episode sparked questions or clarity for you, I'd love to hear. You can find me at daveschoof.com. That's Dave and then SCHOOF. Or join the conversation over on LinkedIn or Substack. And if you like the podcast, please subscribe. And if you know of anyone who might benefit from understanding the times we're in and the need for the pivot, please forward. As always, thank you for tuning into The Pivot, where we meet at the edges, explore the in-between, and stay with what's unfolding. Until next time, keep listening, keep feeling, keep exploring, and keep finding your way. This is Dave Schoof at The Pivot.